On an English racecourse 100 years ago, the most feared object in the ring was not a knife and not a gun. It was a small wet sponge sitting in a bucket of water. Between races, a man walked down the line of bookmakers, wiping the odds from their boards, and for that single service he charged ½ a crown, and no bookmaker dared refuse him. He wiped, held out his hand and moved on. And the man who decided who could carry that bucket, on every course in England worth the carrying, came from a back street in Birmingham. For a few short and violent years, he was the most powerful gangster in Britain. His name was Billy Kimber. He came out of the poorest streets of the city, and for more than a decade his men held its underworld in their fists, its illegal betting, its protection money, its dark streets after the pubs turned out, before their reach spread across the racecourses of half of England. And almost everything you think you know about him is wrong, because the story reached the world through a television show that told it backwards. This is the story of the city of 1,000 trades, and the man who made his fortune everywhere but there, a city that built almost everything, and a gang that built almost nothing but a myth. And it ends, strangely, with a gang whose entire legend is about blinding other people, brought down because it could not see clearly who was sitting inside a coach on a warm afternoon in June. But before the racecourses, before the razors, before any of it, there was the city itself. Birmingham did not grow the way other great cities grew. It had no cathedral to speak of, no royal court, no harbour opening onto the sea. It grew out of iron and skill, and 1,000 small workshops crammed into its streets. By the middle of the 19th century, people called it the City of 1,000 Trades, and the name was almost literal. Here they made buttons and buckles, pen nibs and gun barrels, jewellery and coins, locks and keys, and above all things made of brass, which Birmingham cast better than anywhere on earth. It was the city that had helped to power the age. Here, at his great Soho works, Matthew Boulton had gone into partnership with the engineer James Watt to build the steam engines that pushed the industrial world into being. Birmingham did not only make things, for a while it made the future. The people came in their hundreds of thousands to make it. In 1801, Birmingham held around 70,000 souls. By the close of that century, more than 500,000, and it would soon overtake Manchester to become the second city of the country. In the 1870s, a screw manufacturer turned politician named Joseph Chamberlain became its mayor, and in barely 3 years he hauled the gas and waterworks into public ownership, cleared the worst of the slums, drove a grand new boulevard through the centre, and built libraries, schools and public baths for ordinary people. Visitors began to call Birmingham the best governed city in the world, a place where a clever workshop hand really could rise to become a master of his trade. That was one Birmingham. There was another one lying directly underneath it, and the two were separated by only a few streets. The wealth of 1,000 trades did not fall evenly across the city that made it. It pooled at the top and left the bottom in the dark. When Chamberlain himself stood before the town council to argue for tearing down the slums, he described the places his reforms had not yet reached as the dank, dark, dreary courts and alleys where families were raised amid every kind of squalor. In districts like Summer Lane and Aston and Small Heath, families packed into back-to-back houses, a dozen homes crowded around a shared yard with one cold tap and one shared privy, breathing the smoke of the very furnaces that were making the city rich. And it was into this second Birmingham, into a court off Summer Lane, in the winter of 1883, that William Kimber was born. His father was a labourer. His early world was one room on a street where the air itself tasted of hot metal. He trained, it is said, as a brass caster, learning in the city that cast the world's brass to pour molten metal into a mould and turn it into something a man could sell. He would spend the rest of his life doing something very like that. He simply chose a different kind of mould. Because in the streets where young Kimber was growing up, another trade entirely was thriving, one that appeared in no directory and paid no rates. From the early 1870s, gangs of young men had begun to rule the poorest quarters of Birmingham after dark. The most feared were called the Sloggers, or the Cheapside Slogging Gang, and for the better part of 30 years they fought over territory with a savagery that filled the city's newspapers. Their favoured weapon was a heavy leather belt with a thick brass buckle, swung at a man's head, and their battles could pull hundreds of youths into a single street. In 1872, one report described 400 roughs bringing what it called indiscriminate violence to the Cheapside area, with a handful of constables managing only 3 arrests. They preyed on their own neighbours, and when they killed policemen too. In 1897, a constable named George Snipe was murdered by a slogger the city remembered only as Cloggy Williams, and after that Birmingham understood that the streets did not belong to the law once the lamps came on, and out of that same world came a name that would one day travel further than anyone in Birmingham could have dreamed. In March of 1890, a young teetotaler named George Eastwood stopped for a ginger beer at a public house in Small Heath and was set upon in the street by a group of local youths. The newspaper that reported the attack called his assailants the Peaky Blinders. It is one of the first times the name appears anywhere in print. A young man from the Garrison Lane slums named Henry Lightfoot was among the first ever to be branded with it. These were real people, with real faces, and their faces still survive, because the Birmingham police had become one of the first forces in the country to photograph the people they arrested. Now, you have almost certainly heard where that name is supposed to come from. The story goes that these men stitched razor blades into the peaks of their flat caps so they could headbutt a victim and slash him blind in the same motion. It is a wonderful, terrible image. It is also, the historian Carl Chin has argued, almost certainly a myth. Disposable razor blades were barely available anywhere in Britain when the Peaky Blinders were at their height, and where they did exist, they were expensive. The last thing a poor man from a back court would sew into a hat and ruin. The earliest of these men did not even wear the flat cap we all now picture. They wore a hard-working man's bowler called a billycock. The likelier truth is quieter, and in its way sadder. Peaky, for the peak of the cap they wore low over the eyes. Blinder, in the Birmingham slang of the day, for a young man who dressed sharp and turned heads, a man who looked, as they said, a blinder. It was a fashion and a reputation before it was ever a gang. And by the time the world fell in love with the razor in the cap, the men who had worn those caps were already gone. Because the real Peaky Blinders were fading away even before the First World War, ground down by tougher policing and by magistrates handing out harder sentences. The name limped on as a loose insult for any street tough in the city, and the young men who had once run in those gangs, the ones with real ambition, went looking for something bigger than a street corner and a swung belt. One of them was Billy Kimber, and what Kimber understood, earlier and more clearly than almost anyone of his generation, was that there was a vast river of money in England hiding in plain sight, and that the law itself had told everybody exactly where to find it. The law was the Betting Act of 1845. It had been written by respectable men to stamp out gambling, and instead it did almost the precise opposite. It made betting for ready cash illegal in almost every place a man might want to do it. Almost every place. The one spot where a working man could still legally lay down a bet with money in his hand was on the racecourse itself, on the day, in the open ring. So decade after decade, The nation's appetite for a wager was funneled by law into one narrow channel. On race days at Epsom and Ascot and Kempton and Newmarket, and a dozen courses besides, hundreds of thousands of pounds in loose cash gathered in one open field, in the leather satchels of the bookmakers, protected by nothing except the men who chose to stand around them. Then the war ended and the money multiplied. Soldiers came home from France with back pay in their pockets and a hunger to spend it on anything that felt like being alive again. In the brief, giddy boom after 1918, racecourse attendances climbed to levels never seen before. The bookmakers' bags bulged, and where the cash gathered in the open air, so did the men who wanted a share of it without earning it. For years that had meant chaos. Any passing bully could demand a cut of a bookmaker's takings. Pickpockets worked the crush of the crowd, and card sharps and trick men fleeced the punters. A nervous bookmaker might hire a minder, and that minder might just as easily turn on a winning customer to spare his employer a payout. It was disorder, and disorder, as any factory master in Birmingham could have told you, is expensive. What Billy Kimber did was impose order, brutal, greedy, one-sided order, weighted entirely in favour of the men who imposed it, but order all the same. In a world left to the strongest arm, he made the strongest arm predictable, and to a frightened bookmaker with a bag full of other people's money, predictable is worth paying for. He gathered the hard men of Birmingham into a gang the newspapers took to calling the Birmingham Boys, the Birmingham Boys, and he was by every account of the men who knew him, an unlikely sort of boss, not a raving thug, but a calm and clever man, well-spoken, magnetic, able to plan and to hold other violent men to a plan. The system he built on the racecourse was almost elegant in its cruelty. On the ground, Kimber controlled. A bookmaker paid for everything. He paid for his pitch, the patch of grass he stood on, for the printed list of runners, for the chalk and the stool. And he paid for that man with the bucket and the little sponge, who came along between every race and wiped the board clean, whether the bookmaker wanted it wiped or not. Half a crown every time. And after all of that, he still handed over a share of his profits, a share that could climb toward half of everything he made. The gang took its cut of every good afternoon. On the bad afternoons, the losses belonged to the bookmaker alone. To hold that much ground, Kimber needed allies, and here his real gift showed itself. He set up a second base in Islington, in North London, to work the southern courses, and he made himself the friend of London's harder gangs, the men of the Elephant and Castle led by Wag MacDonald, the Camden Town crowd, the Hoxton mob, the Finsbury boys. He had lived among some of them for years, having lodged with the MacDonald family south of the river before the war. And so, for a remarkable stretch in those post-war years, the map of organised crime in England ran back to a brass caster from a court off Summer Lane. Historians who have gone back through the police files and newspapers of the day have reached a conclusion that sounds like invention and is not. For several years around the end of the First World War, this man from a Birmingham back court was very probably the single most powerful organised criminal in the whole United Kingdom. Not a household name, not a face in the papers, but a quiet, careful man who took his percentage of a nation's gambling and let almost nobody see him do it. And here is the part that unsettles the simple story. Many people were quietly glad that he was there. A bookmaker knew that once he had paid the Birmingham Boys their due, no freelance bully would dare touch him. To an ordinary punter, the racecourse under Kimber's rule felt safer than it had in years. That is the uncomfortable engine at the heart of every protection empire. It sells you safety from itself, and the safety is real. And so, quietly, Without a headline announcing it, a gang of Birmingham men came to govern one of the largest cash economies in the country, its hidden river of money, and much of the same river as it ran across the rest of England. By the early 1920s, Kimber was living well. He kept company with Annie Moran, sister of the celebrated Birmingham boxer Owen Moran, and by all accounts a formidable fighter in her own right. He moved between Birmingham and London like a man of business, which, in his own opinion, he very nearly was. It was said he had policemen in his pay, and given the corruption of that racecourse world, the claim is easy to believe. He dressed sharply, spoke softly, and made himself agreeable to the sort of respectable men who would later be astonished to learn what he had once been. But a river that rich always draws more than one set of hands. And down in London, another man had begun to look hard at the southern courses and to wonder why a Birmingham man should keep them. His name was Charles Sabini, though everyone called him Derby. He had grown up in the Italian quarter around Saffron Hill in Clerkenwell, the son of an Italian father and an English mother. He had built a following among the Italian families of London, and working alongside the feared London gangster Alfie Solomon, among the Jewish bookmakers of the East End as well. Those East End bookmakers had suffered badly when the Birmingham Boys first pushed south, singled out and squeezed harder than the rest. Many of them Jewish men who had watched Kimber's cruise reserved their worst treatment for anyone not English. So they turned to one of their own community's power brokers, a man named Edward Emanuel, and Emanuel turned to Derby Sabini for protection against the protectors. Sabini's calling card was the razor, drawn down a cheek to leave a scar a man would carry for the rest of his life, and it was said in the trade that 9 racing men in every 10 lived in plain terror of his crew. If the Sabinis could guard the southern bookmakers so effectively, why should they not take the southern trade for themselves? What followed across the whole of the year 1921, the newspapers came to call the Racecourse Wars. It was a war of ambushes and beatings, fought at the tracks and in the back streets and nightclubs of London, with knuckle dusters and broken bottles and open razors, and more often revolvers. In March, Kimber's men caught up with Sabini at a trotting track at Greenford and set about him, and Sabini, cornered and outnumbered, drew an unlicensed revolver and shot his way clear. A few days later, Kimber himself went to King's Cross, it seems to bargain with the other side, and was found there shot and beaten in the street. He survived, as he seemed to survive everything, but the message was plain. The Birmingham man was no longer safe in the south, and then came the single afternoon that broke him. It broke him in the cruelest way imaginable, because in the end he did it to himself. It was the 2nd of June, 1921, Coronation Cup Day, with the crowd streaming home along the London road from the racing near Epsom. Kimber's men had learned that a group of bookmakers from Leeds would be travelling that road in a hired motor coach. These Leeds men had been Kimber's own allies, but word had gone round the Birmingham camp that they were switching their loyalty to Sabini, and to the Birmingham Boys a traitor in the ranks was worse than an honest enemy. So they lay in wait along the road near Ewell. A taxi was driven hard up the hill and rammed straight into the oncoming coach. The tyres burst with a sound like gunfire, and a mob fell on the passengers with hammers and hatchets and bottles and bricks and stakes torn from the roadside hedges. 6 men were carried away to hospital with their scalps laid open. And here is the terrible heart of the whole thing. The men in that coach were not Sabini's Italians at all. They were the Leeds bookmakers, Kimber's own former people, most of them Jewish men who had done him no wrong. In the confusion and the fury and the certainty of their own righteousness, the Birmingham Boys had fallen upon the wrong coach. A gang whose entire myth was built on the art of blinding other men had proven, at the one decisive moment of its history, to be blind itself. The reckoning came swiftly. The scene had been so wild that the first word to reach the police was that a Sinn Féin riot had broken out on the London road, and officers rushed there expecting Irish revolutionaries rather than bookmakers' muscle from the Midlands. They traced the gang's coach to a public house on Kingston Hill, the George and Dragon, and mustered 50 officers to take them. When the prisoners were held at Kingston, a crowd of some 1,500 gathered outside to watch them moved. 28 Birmingham men stood trial at Guildford, charged with conspiring to do grievous bodily harm. And you should listen to the roll of them as it was read out when the judge, Mr. Justice Rowlatt, came to pass his sentences. Because in the recorded trades of these men, you can hear the whole of that other, hidden Birmingham. There was Arthur Vincent, 32, a bookmaker with no previous convictions and a good army record, given 9 months of hard labour. There was Thomas Conway, a labourer of 36, and Ernest Hughes, a coster of 28, and William Goulding, a labourer of 45. And there was Thomas Tuckey, 33, whose trade was set down in the record as wire worker, a wire worker. In the city of 1,000 trades, even the gangsters had honest day jobs waiting for them. Of the 28 men in the dock, 23 were found guilty, and they went down for terms running from 9 months to 3 years of penal servitude. The plucky sergeant who had done so much to help take them, a man named Dawson, was commended from the bench and rewarded by the commissioner with the sum of £5. A police constable in that year earned a little over £3 in a week. The man who helped to break the most powerful criminal gang in England was paid, for his trouble, the rough equivalent of a fortnight's wages. Kimber was not finished, not quite yet. That August his men clashed once again with the southern gangs at the races in Bath, but the ground had shifted for good beneath his feet. The newspapers were howling now about ruffianism and terror at the races, and the pressure on the police had become unbearable. With the press baying for action, the two exhausted sides were pushed toward a table, and there they did something that would have looked almost reasonable in a boardroom. They divided the country between them. Kimber and his allies would keep the Midlands and the North and a share of the Western meetings. Sabini would take the rich courses of the South. Two criminal empires, carving up England over a handshake, the way two rival firms might carve up a market for buttons or for brass. On paper it looked like a truce between equals. In truth it was a retreat, and Kimber must have understood that perfectly, because Darby Sabini had something Billy Kimber could not match. He had connections that ran far deeper than muscle, into the police, into the racing establishment, into the quiet machinery that could make a gang's brute control look almost respectable. In the August of 1921, even as the beaten Birmingham Boys sat in their cells, a body was formed with a grand and reassuring name, the Racecourse Bookmakers and Backers Protection Association, and it was to the Sabini gang, not the Birmingham gang, that the bookmakers of the South now looked. The old racket had put on a collar and a tie, and it belonged from top to bottom to Darby Sabini. Slowly then, the empire that had once reached all the way back to a Birmingham back street began to contract toward home. The Birmingham Boys held the Midlands and the North for a good while yet, but the southern courses, the richest prizes of all, were gone. And then the whole racket began to wither, and here is the thing worth understanding. It did not die because a stronger gang killed it. It died because the one thing it fed upon was slowly taken away. The jockey club and the racing authorities reformed the way the pitches in the ring were handed out, allocating them by orderly rule and by ballot rather than by whoever could hold the ground with a hammer. A bookmaker no longer needed to buy his chalk and his sponge and his stool from a gangster, because his place in the ring was now his by right. Better policing reached the tracks at last, the channel that the old betting act had dug, the one that funneled all that loose cash into a single field to be taxed by whoever held it, was slowly filled back in, and so there was less and less, year on year, for a protection gang to protect. The men who had fought so hard for the ring lived out endings no television writer would dare to invent, because they were, every one of them, far too quiet. Darby Sabini's own power faded through the 1930s. He was ruined in part by a libel case that went against him and left him bankrupt. And later, when another war came and Italy fought on the other side of it, he was interned as an enemy alien, locked away for the crime of the Italian name he had been born with, a foreigner, in the very country where he had lived his whole life. He died in 1950, poor and largely forgotten by a public that had once trembled at the mention of his crew. And Billy Kimber, the most powerful gangster in all of Britain, did not die in a hail of bullets on a Birmingham street. He simply drifted out of the underworld entirely and into something that looked, from the outside, like a comfortable retirement. He made certain that his daughters were well educated. He carried himself as a bookmaker and a gentleman of the turf. And by October of 1940, in the far softer setting of the southwest coast, William Kimber, the boy from the court off Summer Lane, had become the respected president of the Devon and Cornwall Bookmakers Association. The extortioner had become a chairman. He died on the 27th of June 1945 in a nursing home in Torquay after a long illness in his early 60s. His funeral was attended by respectable men of the racing world, and many had not the faintest idea of the life he had once led. One of his old allies, the London gangster Wag MacDonald, is supposed to have travelled further still. According to a memoir written within his own family, MacDonald fled abroad after the racecourse wars and eventually washed up in Los Angeles, where for a time he worked as a bodyguard to Charlie Chaplin. The story may well have grown taller in the telling, but it belongs to the strangeness of the whole affair that the road out of a Birmingham slum could run, for at least one of these men, all the way to the gates of Hollywood. So let us go back at last to the promise on the screen and be honest about it. Did the mob secretly run Britain's second city in the only way that a phrase like that can ever be true? Yes. For a decade and more, the illegal betting of Birmingham, its street rackets, its whole hidden economy of loose cash and fear, answered in the end to men like Billy Kimber. And their reach went far beyond the city itself, across the racecourses of half of England. That is a real empire. It was real power, and it was hidden almost entirely from the respectable people who lived right beside it and never knew. But the town hall was never theirs. The great factories were never theirs. The best governed city in the world was governed in daylight by its council and its industrialists and its clerks, and Kimber's kingdom was only ever the shadow that all of that bright daylight cast, never the thing itself. And the part of the legend that is loudest of all, the version the whole world now carries in its head, is the part furthest from the truth. In the famous drama, Kimber is a swaggering enemy shot dead by a brooding hero who never existed at all. The real Kimber outlived that fiction by a quarter of a century and died quietly in his bed by the sea. The drama dresses its gangsters in razor caps that the real men almost certainly never wore. It folds two separate generations, the street sloggers of the 1890s and the racecourse kings of the 1920s, into a single family in a single decade. The fiction is thrilling, but the fact is stranger and quieter, and in the end more human. The most powerful crime boss in Britain was a clever, courteous man who once cast brass in a Birmingham workshop, who cornered a national market, who attacked the wrong coach on a summer afternoon, who lost his whole empire because of it, and who retired to the seaside to chair a committee. Walk the ground today, and most of it has been wiped clean, like the odds off a board between two races. The back-to-back courts of Summer Lane, where Kimber first drew breath, are long gone, swept away in the slum demolitions of the last century, and the streets that first bred the Peaky Blinders have been rebuilt so many times that little the real men knew survives. What survives mostly is paper and glass and old photographs. In a Victorian police lockup on Steelhouse Lane, the West Midlands Police Museum keeps what is thought to be the largest single collection of prisoner mugshots anywhere in the country, and there the faces of the real gang members still stare out from their little ornate frames, hard and young and heartbreakingly ordinary, boys who could be photographed for a robbery one year and lost to an unmarked grave the next. The city that once made 1,000 different things now sells the world, the memory of the men who made almost nothing at all. The furnaces have gone cold. The myth burns on brighter than ever, and when you finally strip that myth away, what you are left with is that one small wet sponge sitting in its bucket of water, and the man walking down the line of bookmakers between the races, wiping every board clean in turn, collecting his half a crown from each of them as he goes. A gang whose whole legend was the dark art of blinding other men, undone at the last not by a rule book and not by a rival's bullet, but by its own mistaken glance, by charging up a hill in a fury and falling upon the wrong men, because at the one moment that mattered most, it could not see clearly who was sitting inside the coach. Billy Kimber saw the money in the ring more clearly than any man alive in his day. He simply never quite saw what it was costing him until the moment it was already gone. If you found this story worth your time, do one thing before you go. Subscribe so that the next one finds its way to you. And if you would like to stay in this world a little longer, YouTube reckons you will enjoy the video now showing on your screen, and I think for once it is right.